the making of any film is a long and rocky road. This film was unusual in the sense that as soon as we began work and we committed to making it, it was almost as if unseen forces sort of rallied behind us, and I got the feeling very early on that the film wanted to be made, that this animal wanted its story to be told. And because money started coming in, support started coming in, people wanted to take part in the film. With this film, people wanted to get behind this animal, wanted to help. The very first, we began work in sort of middle of 2017, and by September of that year, we'd put together the shoot in Ghana, our first trip to meet and learn about the white-bellied tree pangolin. There are 4 African species, by the way, 8 in total in the world, 4 in Asia and 4 in Africa. The reason that the African pangolins are under such threat at the moment is that the illegal pangolin trade has almost decimated their numbers in Asia. And so now those poachers and traffickers are coming for the African pangolins. So we wanted to learn about each of them, get them on film if possible, in spite of the fact that they're very difficult to find. And so this trip to Ghana took place in 2017. So we flew up to Accra and then traveled 8 or 9 hours into the interior to meet up with Maxwell Boache, who had studied here in South Africa for 10 years before returning to Ghana to take up the challenge. And it's an enormous challenge to study these animals in the forest. You'll see why very shortly. After 3 days of travel, we went into the Bia National Forest, and he had a relationship with the forest guards, who were remarkable in their ability to track and find these animals. And they brought this little guy out in this basket for us to film, because this was going to be our first experience. And there's Maxwell in the middle of the shot. He is removing the parasites from this white-bellied pangolin, which he will then study and learn about the animal, because that's one of the things I learned very quickly, is that almost nothing is known about pangolins. And so the research into them and the study of them is critical in order to help protect them. For example, the numbers, how many are there? People would always ask me, how do you know they're on the edge of extinction if you don't know how many there are? The people who are working to conserve these animals estimate that with all the seizures of illegal shipments and then sort of the reproduction rate of these animals, it's clearly not sustainable. They're being taken out in such vast numbers. They estimate over 1 million animals have been taken in the last 10 years. And there's my first moment of looking into the eye of a pangolin, and it was quite a momentous moment for me. I'm very, very clear that when one does connect with another creature and you're able to spend any amount of time seeing into that eye, that if the eye is the window to the soul, then one can, in my opinion, very clearly feel that there's a sentient being in there that is feeling and thinking, and the fear in these little guys was very, very evident at first, but then they relax. They're quite trusting eventually, and this guy was quite comfortable on the stick, and that's why Maxwell used the stick to take the parasites off, and this is where they gave me an opportunity to encounter this animal for the first time. I've been very privileged over the last few years to meet a number of them, and without fail, everyone that I've engaged with or met has been quite an experience. It's one reason why I'm still involved with them, is that there's definitely a reason for looking after them and doing anything that one can. And my skill, my background, my talents are involved with storytelling, and if I can use stories to tell people about this animal, then that's what I do. I love this particular photograph just because it's almost as though the pangolin was looking down its nose at me, and it's got quite a nose. So then we headed into the forest. We spent a number of days in these forests. They're very careful to return a pangolin to the exact location that they've taken it from, because they're very careful about not affecting its habits as much as possible. So we took it back into the particular place where it had been retrieved, and then placed it on this log, which that log was just thousands, in fact probably millions of ants in that area, as that dead wood in the forest, and that's, you know, their food source. So that's where we returned it to. The next pangolin we decided to go and meet, hopefully, was a local one, the Temminck's ground pangolins, which are found in southern Africa. And we headed up into the Kalahari to meet with a researcher called Dr. Wendy. No, she's not a doctor yet. She's nearly a doctor. And in this particular area in the Kalahari, and spends, because they're mostly nocturnal, she spends night after night in the Kalahari, tracking them. She attaches trackers to some of the animals that she's studying, and she will find the burrow, and then sit waiting at the burrow for it to emerge. So this is how we were able to film animals that, if we were just wandering into the bush looking for them, it's highly unlikely we would have found them. So then you've found the burrow that it's in, and you wait. And we spent many hours sitting in the Kalahari, which is not the worst place in the world to be. It's quite spectacular. You'll see some of the pictures, but there's Johan, and it was cold. We were there in winter, so we were bundled up and waiting as the sun went down. And eventually, this particular pangolin, Wendy doesn't name her pangolins, but she has to record them. So this was P4, pangolin number 4, and we just got to know him as P4. He was very habituated to Wendy. He had a special connection with him, and this is what we found with almost all the people who've engaged with these animals, that they develop really close bonds with them and get to know them. It's quite wonderful to witness, actually, and you can see the sheer delight on my face that I'm getting close to this animal. And then he came right up to us at a number of points. Johan got this exquisite photo, which you might recognize as the photo we used for the poster. And again, looking into the eye of the animal it's quite a privilege to get this close to them. I'm not a scientist. I'm not even really in the true terms. I'm not a conservationist. I'm a filmmaker, but because my films are involved in conservation efforts, I've learned an enormous amount about the conservation of these animals and the science around them. I value my relationships with this network of people who are still involved with pangolins enormously, because without them, I wouldn't have made this film, and I wouldn't be making the next one. And that's Wendy heading into the sunset. That's how she lives her life. Just an aside is, you obviously you're in a beautiful place like the Kalahari, and you meet other creatures, and so they're all part of the pangolin's world. So this was Johan meeting a meerkat, and what amazing little creatures these guys are too. Johan's made his first film was about Kalahari ground squirrels, so he was very, very familiar with getting down to the level of these animals and telling their stories. Some of the benefits of making films like this is being in very special, beautiful places at great moments, and this is a sunrise in the Kalahari, which was extremely cold. And I took this photograph just to show what the temperature was at 7:30 in the morning, so you can imagine what it was 2 hours before that. There we're following P4 through the bush. This was sort of in the early hours of the morning. The next pangolin that we wanted to try and get footage of and learn about was the black-bellied tree pangolin. And for this animal, we were put in touch with a very special place in the Central African Republic called Sanga Lodge. and it's quite an ordeal to get there. But once you're there, it's a different kind of paradise. And so we flew to the capital of Central African Republic, and then caught a small plane to fly down into the jungle, and that's the Sangha River as we're approaching the final landing. And this was the plane that we eventually got into the jungle with, and that is Rod Cassidy and his wife Tamar, who some of you might know him. He's a renowned birding guide in Africa, and has been guiding all over Africa for all his life. But he's now settled at Sangha. Soon after arriving there, apparently he developed this very strong bond with some pangolins that were brought to him by locals that had been retrieved from traders. They have set up a small rehabilitation and research facility at the lodge. They've gotten funding for it, and I think Maya Gudehus who's a Swiss researcher and veterinarian, I think. She is based there and runs their little pangolin rehab facility, and that's where we got to learn about the black-bellied pangolin. This is on one of Rod's boats heading up the river, for a trip into the forest. It's very dense. You can see why if we'd been doing this without assistance, without help, we would never have been able to find these animals, because they're highly elusive and very difficult to find. This is another one of the benefits of being in remarkable places. That's from the deck at the lodge, the sunset over the Sangha River, not far from Cameroon, and that's a real hotspot for the illegal wildlife trafficking. This is a picture of Maya Gudehus, the researcher, who, with Rod and Tamar, they've developed quite a unique way of studying the black-bellied tree pangolins. This is a group of Baaka tribesmen, locals. They're a pygmy tribe, and they have been trained by Rod, Tamar, and now Maya to follow the pangolins in the forest. And the black-bellied are diurnal, so they sleep at night. So fortunately, these guys stick with the pangolins that they find and release, because trackers just don't work. Besides being very expensive, they haven't been developed to the point where they can actually work in a dense situation like that. So these guys, from sunrise to sunset, when the pangolins are active, they follow them. And if you've seen the film, you'll see the sequence where they just sit and watch and crane their necks up and into the topmost branches of the trees, which is where these guys feed and move around. And they've all developed incredibly strong bonds with the animals, which they're caring for and helping Maya to study. And there is a black-bellied tree pangolin that was rehabilitating. It had lost condition and started to slip and fall out of the trees, and so she was looking after it and taking it to feed in the forest, or at points it was even too weak to feed, and so they the Baaka would go and find ants for it and feed it by hand. But they're really, really quite beautiful little creatures, known as the prettiest of the four. They're definitely the smallest, and agile with those tails, with those claws. They like being high up, so that's why the pups will ride on the backs of the mother. When they're put in your hands, they immediately try and climb to the highest point on you. And that's an Nduma, that the little one who was not well, and we were feeding it at the clinic. There's a packet of ants in front of the barker there. The last of the 4 African species that we were hoping to get on film was the giant ground pangolin. Notoriously difficult to find, particularly in the jungles of Central and West Africa. So I got in touch with a eco guide in Gabon called Vianet Mahindu, but the trip to Gabon was going to be our last one, and we were due to do it in February of 2019, and we were all set up with our permits to shoot and our contacts and our schedule. Then there was an attempted coup in Gabon, so everything was thrown up in the air. Our permits were thrown out. We had to reapply, wait to see what was going to happen as a result of this coup. In fact, it turned out it didn't disturb the status quo too much, and we were able to go in just over a month later. But this meant we had to push our release date back of the film. We were planning to release it on World Pangolin Day in February of 2019, but because of this attempted coup in Gabon, we were delayed somewhat, and eventually released it on World Endangered Species Day in May of 2019, which is just over a year ago. In fact, last week it was the anniversary of our release, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. So we flew on a Ethiopian Air via Addis Ababa to Libreville in Gabon. These are just a little screenshot from the plane. And there's Vianet who met us in Libreville, and then we traveled over 9 hours into the interior to Lope, a national park. And there is Gislan. Gislan is the eco guide who had taken this previous group into the forest and found 2 giant pangolins for them, and we were hoping that he would be able to do the same for us. He was a remarkable guy. Didn't speak much English, so we worked with him through Vianet, who would translate. But it was quite an experience going into the forest looking for this guy. And this was the first time we had nothing guaranteed about finding one. The first giant that Vianet did show us was the skeleton, and this gave us some indication of the size of it. This was a skeleton that had been brought to one of the park stations, and we suddenly realized that we were going to be dealing with a much larger creature than any of the previous ones that we'd seen. This was the little eco station, the research station that was semi-abandoned. It was very, very rustic, that we stayed in while we would travel. We hiked into the forest every night looking for this animal. No toilet facilities, no bathroom facilities. The river in the valley was where we used as our bathroom. But this was a map of the area, which was quite intimidating because it didn't look like anyone knew where anything was. But we came to learn some of those rivers and some of those paths over the next week that we were there. This was the river in the valley, and this was during the day. We spent our time filming, looking for the giant during the night. We would leave at 8 o'clock and usually come back around midnight, but a couple of nights we only got back the next morning. So it was quite an extreme adventure. Johan carrying his film gear, and me looking a little concerned about my sanity at that point. And I got bitten by something, and I traveled into the village to try and get some treatment for it, but that was fortunately didn't turn out to be too serious. The long story, or the short story, is that we did not find a giant pangolin in Gabon with Gislan, but this is a French doctor, David Lehman, who works in a research station in Lope National Forest. and he had some camera traps out. He was also looking for giant pangolins, and he'd been looking for many months. So he wasn't surprised that we didn't find one, but he very kindly offered us some of his camera trap footage with giants on it. So we were able to get giant pangolins into the film and talk to David about his project of his attempt to study them, which is trapping them and attaching trackers so that he could follow them, which he's now done subsequently. And he lives there. He's been there for a number of years, and he's studying all sorts of creatures, mandrills being one of them. But the giant pangolin has become a primary project over the last year. He's now got 4 giant pangolins tagged and is following and studying them. And the biggest male is 38 kilograms. So, from 1.5 to 3 or 4 kilograms, which are the small guys, the black-bellied and the white-bellied. These giant pangolins are significantly larger, and apparently David says when they do find one and they need to sedate it in order to attach a tracker to it, there's mayhem and chaos in that forest, and a number of them have been cut quite badly, but some of the scales are very sharp, because these guys are quite tricky to manage. There are a number of sequences or characters that didn't make it into the film. This guy, and he works with following a pangolin and studying it and recording it, monitoring it for the African Pangolin Working Group, he and his dog. These 2 women were just remarkable in terms of their care for pangolins. They were based in Hoedspruit with Rhino Revolution, and they'd gotten involved in pangolin rehabilitation, and we were able to film them. We spent a few days with them, and this is one of the pangolins that they were releasing in the Kruger Park area that Johan was filming. Sort of the end result was when you launch your film and it goes out into the world. And so Johan and I are still smiling after nearly 2 years of some rather extreme but amazing experiences. This is the title of our next film, because I always felt that there was much more to be told about this animal. So the question that I'm following on scales, which we're in the middle of producing at the moment, is why is this animal, why does the traditional Chinese medicine market want these scales so badly? Why is the meat a delicacy? Why are they prepared to wipe out a whole species? What is our relationship with nature and the natural world and the creatures on the planet that we live with? What are we doing with our lives as we engage with them? So it's a film that I think is relevant, and we've got a lot of work still to do, but it's a film that we're hoping to release in February next year on World Pangolin Day, if we're able to open up and get to the places that we still need to go to. We got to go to Zimbabwe in July, if possible, and then the US and Asia later in the year.
Thanks, Bruce. Would you unshare your screen for us, just so we can see you again?
Yeah.
If anyone's got questions, I'm going to ask Bruce a couple now. What I found from the film fascinating was someone said that these pangolins are the Earth's great gardeners, that they completely change the landscape when they're looking for these termites or these ants. And someone even mentioned without the pangolins, the forests might die. Maybe you can tell us about that, and that one story about the islands where one of them was negatively affected.
Well, one of the first questions I asked myself as a filmmaker, and those are the kind of questions that guide my story or the direction of the narrative, is why should we save this animal? Why is it important? How does it fit into the ecosystem? And there was a doctor who explained with this example about a series of islands that were being they were part of a new dam that was being built, and there were all the creatures that fed on the ants on these islands were removed, and so the ants basically wiped out all the foliage, all the green stuff on the island, and it became completely denuded and barren. And that's the danger. That's what's might happen if the pangolins, the gardeners who protect, who look after the planet, if they're removed. So that's the fear, that if this balance is upset, then by removing creatures like this, that there's a potential for ants and termites, for example, in this instance, to turn vast areas into semi-deserts, you know.
And it was mentioned that these are really ancient creatures, 18 million years old. Do you think it's realistic that in our lifetimes that we could see the extinction of the species, yet they've been around for millions and millions of years?
It seems to me, with my experience of talking to people and traveling around looking for these animals, that enormous danger of disappearing. And as I say, I'm not a scientist, and even the scientists admit that it's very difficult to measure their numbers. But I work on sort of anecdotal material mostly, and a number of the people that are working with pangolins in Cameroon, in Central African Republic, in Ghana, a number of individuals spoke about the fact that they grew up in rural areas, and when they were growing up 20, 30 years ago, these animals were very prevalent. They were in the bushmeat markets. They were found in forests, and now when they go home to these areas, most of these guys now live in the cities. They're not seen at all. They're not in the bushmeat. They're not for sale in the bushmeat markets, and so that to me is indicative of the fact that these animals are disappearing. You know, and as I said earlier, when you look at the tonnage of scales, and for every ton there's apparently 1900 plus minus animals that have died for 1 ton of scales. And I had an experience in Nigeria 2 months ago when I was up there. A customs official asked me in the middle of the interview, would I like to see some scales? And I hadn't expected him to offer this, but I said yes, of course. And he walked us down the road behind a warehouse, and there was a container, one of these big shipping containers, and he opened it up, big padlock off, and there were, he said, in the street market, or the price on the black market for these scales in that container alone was something like $19 million. And I went in, and and they were giant pangolin scales as well. There were bags almost as tall as me, of giant pangolin scales. And I know how difficult it would be for me to find a giant pangolin. We didn't find one. And everywhere in Gabon, they talked about how difficult it is they don't see giants anymore. And there were bags and bags and bags of scales, which begs the question, which is, how are the poachers finding them in these numbers? And I asked this of a number of people in various organizations, the traffic organization who monitor the illegal wildlife trade in particular. And they said, it's the fact that there's a price on them. You've got guys who know the forests intimately. They've grown up in them. They've hunted for their living, and now you put a price that is, you know, sometimes vastly greater than they would earn in a year in normal circumstances, and then they suddenly, instead of, you know, 4 or 5 hunters in the village, you've got 20 guys looking for these animals, and that's one of the reasons that they're able to hunt them and poach them in these kind of numbers.
That's exactly what Sven was asking, is how come they are the most trafficked animals in the world if they are so hard to find? Do you think the way we're treating animals talks to our relationship with nature, the way that we're treating these pangolins right now? It all comes back to that balance. But what does it
well,
say?
that's what I'm hoping to inspire people and motivate people to think about, is each of us, our own relationship with the natural world, and not just with pangolins. You know, what about our world around us, where we live, the birds, the entire picture of fauna and flora around each one of us in our worlds. If we can look out our window and think about what am I doing that I haven't thought about, that has been thoughtless, or just because my parents did it, or grandparents, you know, that's what I want to inspire people to re-examine through the films that we're making at the moment.
So I think the big question that a lot of us want to ask is, were pangolins responsible for the crossover into humans with COVID-19? And not just the crossover. You spoke about some interesting research that is also happening with regards to possible they might be able to help with the cure.
The study that linked them or put them in as an intermediate host between bats and humans, as I said, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to be fairly convincing, and it's now has to be peer reviewed, and the whole theory has to be looked at very closely. But I think when you learn about, you know, the wet markets in China, which are similar to the bushmeat trade markets in Africa, where I have been, then there is something amiss there. There's something wrong. There's something that needs to change if we're going to continue and survive. And so I think it's highly likely that they were part of the story. But as I mentioned to you just 2 weeks ago, news came out about a study by some Austrian scientists in Vienna that have found potential antidotes or potential for a cure in the pangolins. So that is also very, very new. But as I keep saying, what it's done is brought pangolins into the spotlight. So actually people know about these animals and know about their situation and know how close they are to extinction. And I mean, our film is up on YouTube, and the viewing numbers just rocketed during the beginning of lockdown. We were having 40,000-50,000 a day for a week. You know, that just took us out of well over 100,000. Now we're approaching 300,000 views, because people want to know. They've heard about this animal, and so that's you know, that's the objective of our film, was to get people to learn about this animal, and hopefully we're helping, you know.
I mean, do you have hope? Is there a silver lining? Do you think that maybe the trade might be stopped in some small way? Or, I mean, at least people are being aware about pangolins, but do you have hope, or are you quite depressed by the situation?
As Rod Cassidy said at the end of the film, I used that line because it was very, very relevant to me. And I think the only way you can be a conservationist is to be an optimist as well. Otherwise you have to believe somewhere in your heart that the light will come through, the light will conquer the darkness, if you like, in very simplistic terms. And so I have hope that this animal will survive this phase. But if it doesn't, I want people to at least to consciously ask questions about their own relationship with nature. So yeah, Michael, I don't know the answer to the question, but I couldn't carry on doing what I do if I didn't believe somehow that there was hope, you know.
What do you think? I asked, I guess, last week the same question. What do you think nature's trying to tell us through COVID-19? And is it similar to the message that pangolins might be saying to us humans? What do you think that is?
I think the intelligence of nature is unlimited and so vast that if we can just become conscious of that and clock into that we will begin to change our relationship. And so for me, situations like this, stories like this, Jenny Cullinan's, you know, work with the wild bees is, I know Jenny well, and her work is so clearly about if we can learn from nature, if we can learn from the creatures that we share the planet with, then we can grow and we can refine our balance, because I think we've lost it. And if we can stay open to these messages, the dark ones and the light ones, then there is hope.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your stories with us. And maybe just as a final goodbye, could you maybe just tell people where they watch your films? You mentioned this on YouTube, how they can make a difference, or how even in their small way, if they can't contribute funding, how do they share this message? How do they help pangolins?
The major message of Eye of the Pangolin was awareness. So if you watch the film, if you haven't watched the film, watch it. And if it moves you in any way, share it with anyone in your network, because the more people who know about it, if knowledge is power, then there's potential for this situation to change. So that's the initial action that I would ask people is to just talk about it. And then Pangolin.Africa is our partner in the Pangolin campaign, and their website, Pangolin.Africa, has a range of options for us, each of us, to contribute in small ways. They're involved in a number of pangolin conservation projects. So would be my first port of call if someone wants to get actively involved, which would be really great, because they're worth it. These guys are very special.
Well, please don't stop doing what you're doing. Please keep making the films. We'd love to see how Scales turns out. And good luck and stay safe. And thank you so much for sharing your story with us this week.
Thank you for this opportunity to tell the pangolin story, and to all the people who've helped, because I'm just part of a team that makes these films, and the people who fund us, and all the people around the world who open their hearts and their work to our filmmaking. So it's a network, and if people can support this network, I'd be enormously grateful.